My name is Olesya Chromychuk. I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. We champion Ukrainian culture and shape conversation about Ukraine in the UK and beyond. And we explore Ukrainian perspectives on global challenges. We're an independent charity, so we're always really grateful to everybody who is able to support us with a donation or by spreading the word about our work and attending our events. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all at today's webinar on Andrii Portnov's new book, Dnipro, An Entangled History of a European City. I will introduce both of our speakers today. It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker and the author of the book, Andrii Portnov, who is a professor of Entangled History of Ukraine at the European University Viadrina. He's director of PRISMA UKRAÍNA Research Network Eastern Europe and a member of the Ukrainian PEN-Club. Since 2012, Andrii has conducted research and lectured at the Universities of Basel, Cambridge, Geneva, Potsdam, Free University Berlin, Free University Brussels, Humboldt University of Berlin, SciencesPo in Paris, SciencesPo in Lyon, Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin, and many other places. He is the author and co-editor of 10 books and numerous articles on intellectual history, historiography, urban history, genocide, and memory studies. And today, Andrii will be in conversation with Marci Shore. Marci Shore teaches modern European intellectual history. She taught at Indiana University before coming to Yale. Her research focuses on the intellectual history of 20th and 21st century Central and Eastern Europe. Marci Shore is the author of Caviar and Ashes, a Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism, 1918-1968, The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, and the Ukrainian Night and Intimate History of Revolution. In 2018, she received the Guggenheim Fellowship for her current book project, a historiography of phenomenology in East Central Europe. She is a regular visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, where I believe she is at the moment. And presently, she's also co-curating a public seminar, Eurozine Forum, on the uses and disadvantages of historical comparisons for life. So we've got these fantastic speakers today. Marci, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much to Olesya for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to speak with Andrii about anything and everything. I obviously wish the historical events in the background were of a more cheerful nature for us to be celebrating this book. But I'm hoping that we can at least spend the next hour and a half looking at a kind of longue durée narrative arc of Ukrainian history, and not thinking only about atrocity, but also thinking about various human and historical and geographical and industrial and imperial elements that have colored it over the years. And a longue durée history like this kind of perhaps allows us to spend a moment and kind of step back out of an all-encompassing present reality, you know, and look at history as something occurring on a kind of large scale across very long periods of time. And I have a lot to say about that long time, but I'm actually going to try not to talk too much because I want Andrii to talk about his own book. And I want to start by, this book is really, it's a biography of a city. It's called Dnipro, An Entangled History of a European City. And I want to talk later about the idea of what does it mean to write a kind of biography of a city, to kind of turn into both a kind of micro and a macro level, looking across a very long historical arc, but also focusing on a geographically narrow location. And this is a book that began, I think, long before, not only before the full-scale invasion, but also before the war began in the Donbass and also before the Maidan. This is a project that I think Andrii had been percolating throughout Andrei's historian's career. He himself is from this city. His family is from this city. So I'm going to let him get started and introduce the book. And then if he doesn't touch on all the introductory points that I ideally think the audience should have, I will prompt him to fill in some of the blanks. So Andrei, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, dear Marci. Thank you, dear Olesya. Доброго вечора, дорогі колеги. Good evening. So probably I should start with a clear point that I'm not at home, and the stuff you see around me, it's not my, let's say, my apartment or whatever. It's the Evangelical Academy in Tutzing, not far from Munich, where there is a big conference on decolonization in Central, Eastern, and Southern Eastern Europe. And actually, I should tell you that this notion or this category of colonization, decolonization, is not really, let's say, present or reflected on in my book. I could tell you later on. Now, let me show you the book. So that's like material object, yeah, even though it's just, let's say in Tutzing. So it looks like that. There is also a hard copy, theoretically, so with the hardcover. And actually, let me start very briefly, like answering to the point Marci already touched upon. So it's a book about a place which is, I would say, not really known or not really present on the mental map of Europe or even of Ukraine, even though now, because of the full-scale aggression, Russia's aggression and war, there is a bit more attention to the place, right? But still, when I started writing this book, and it happened 10 years ago, believe me or not, I remember how different people, not just in Germany, but also in Germany, they've reacted in a way like, do we even need a story of such place? Even it's like, you know, it has no, no connection to what we know about, Europe, Eastern Europe, name it. And for me, it was like obvious that, yes, we need it. And actually, that's what I want to do. And it took 10 years to finalize it. So very briefly, so if you're talking about this place, it's a huge place. It's a really big city, big in terms of population and in terms of territory. So even nowadays, despite the war, it has around maybe even more million people population, right? And historically, there were 3 official names and different, let's say, unofficial names of it. So 2 well-known official names were Katerynoslav, so reference to the Russian Empress Catherine II. And then in 1926, it was renamed in Dnipropetrovsk. I remember myself, so when I started thinking about the book, it was still Dnipropetrovsk, and I was going to start with the point that even the name is so like unpronounceable for people not speaking in Ukrainian, and actually it fits into the complex history of it. So it was Dnipropetrovsk because of the Bolshevik, Grigory Petrovsky, who worked for years in this place and later on became one of the leaders of Soviet Ukraine, also in the time of the Great Famine, and then lived a long life in Moscow. And then in 2016, the city was renamed Dnipro. Again, like think about it, dear colleagues. So they took Petrovsky out of it, and it's just Dnipro. So the name of the river, so the biggest river of Ukraine, the river that is a phenomenon in itself, if you wish, because historically Ukraine was often divided into left bank and right bank. Ukraine, actually, the old city of Katerynoslav, it was built on the right bank of the river, but nowadays, as you could imagine, the city functions on both. So it's both right and the left bank of the Dnipro River. And if you look at the metaphors, and that was actually very interesting for me, like not official names, but metaphorical names, you have a pretty, I would say, like fascinating list, starting from New Athens. So this reference to the antiquity and the origins of Christianity, or Eastern Christianity, if one wish. Then we have Southern Manchester, so one of those like big industrial places in Europe, during the age of industrialization. And then we have something like, capital of Zastoy, or capital of Brezhnev rule, if you wish, because the city was the biggest Soviet Ukrainian closed city. And why closed? Closed for foreigners because of the rocket industry, engineering and production. So when we are talking about Cold War, yeah, all this terrible stuff and fears and whatever, we should not forget that Dnipro was actually the place where those Soviet rockets directed at the US were literally produced, projected and produced. And in recent years, one could also find a metaphor, which actually I like a lot, the metaphor for Jewish capital of Ukraine, and the metaphor of the heart of Ukraine, especially after the Revolution of Dignity and the events in neighboring Donetsk and Luhansk, right, turned into the centers of this, quasi-separatist movement, which never happened to Dnipro. And again, like to feel how funny and complicated this story is, I could tell you that the city celebrated its centennial, so 100 years, like very recently, actually. It was 1787. I mean, 1787 was the date chosen. It was celebrated in 1887, so late 19th century. So we're talking about a new place, a new city. And actually, it was like symbolically linked to the date when Russian Empress Catherine II laid the foundation stone of the Transfiguration Cathedral. Think about the term transfiguration. It's not just about orthodoxy. It's about transfiguring the steppe, the southern Ukrainian steppe, into a southern center of the Russian Empire. And the same year, the biggest industrial plant was launched there, Bryansky plant of the Dnipropetrovsk. And it's one of the, literally like one of the biggest industrial centers in the entire Russian Empire and Soviet Union later on. And then, like, think about it. It would be logical to celebrate like 200 years, yeah, the bicentennial in 1987. But the local party officials were afraid that Leonid Brezhnev, who was personally linked to the place, that he would not live so long. And that is why they decided to celebrate it a bit earlier in 1976, so the same year when Brezhnev turned 70. And here we have, unfortunately, like a pretty typical story that if you need a new date and you, let's say, ideological story behind it, you ask historians to find a proof to it. And there was a group of historians sent to the archives. They knew what they should look for. I mean, so the arguments for the date, 76. And of course, they found a report produced by the Russian administration about the choice of place for building Katerynoslav. And that's how it was celebrated in 1976, so late Soviet era. And probably I should mention here that nowadays there are big discussions by the local historians about various alternative dates, going back not to Russian imperial, but to the Cossack past of the region. So in fact, we have this very interesting, I would say, ideological controversy between imperial narrative of the city history and the Cossack/Ukrainian narrative of it. We could discuss it later on if you wish. What I'd like to stress here that, you know, my task in writing this book was really difficult because it seems to me that, it is now the very first English language synthesis of the Dnipro history. So unlike Odessa or Lviv, Dnipro was not lucky to have a book which covers its entire history, not some aspects of it, but its entire history. And actually, it's not just historians somehow were reluctant to do it. I would dare to say it was also that this place somehow escapes, evades definition. You know, like I've used this metaphor in the introduction, the unfinished city. It's from Sergei Yefremov's diary. So the prominent Ukrainian literary scholar who visited Dnipro in 1920s, he wrote that like the city is nice, but I feel it's unfinished in everything. And there is another beautiful Ukrainian text by Viktor Petrov Domontovich, who was also born there. And there is no coincidence that for Domontovich, it was also like a rootless place, bez gruntu. So the place without ground, without foundation. Think about it. It's a kind of like rather unusual situation for such a big industrial and political center on the map. Now, how I decided to write this book? So it took a long time, but finally I've decided, first of all, to cover all the periods of history. So not just to focus on, let's say, contemporary or modern, but also, to start like, one could say from the geographical, or if you wish, environmental, analysis, how the lower Dnipro region looked like. It's also, at least for me, very much the history of ideas and cities' imagination. So it's not, at least for me, again, maybe I'm wrong here, it's not like just like urban history per se with a detailed description of architecture and stuff like that. It's more about ideas behind it. It's definitely about different groups and movements in the city. So for instance, I am especially happy that the Jewish past is also like covered, historically, not just the Holocaust, not just the current situation, but like the entire complex, fascinating history of the Jewish community starting from late 18th century. And I hope, hopefully, I've tried my best to put all those events in the proper context of at least European history of the time. So like we have, it was my attempt to include the local stories from Dnipro into a broad debate on the First World War, the Second World War, the industrialization, the modernization, so stuff like that. And I could also tell you like to stop, because I'm not planning to give like a big talk. It's better to answer your questions. Of course, I could quite sincerely tell you what is missing in this book, because if you write a synthesis, you should agree somehow with yourself and the publisher, to take a lot of stuff, out of it. And for instance, I decided finally not to include an overview of previous city histories, because there are some of them written in Ukrainian and Russian, but again, completely unknown, let's say, in the English language context. And I decided not to make such an overview because it's kind of a topic of a separate publication, maybe. Secondly, there is no single reference, and that was my conscious decision, maybe around one, we could discuss it as well, to the full-scale aggression war which started February last year. So the manuscript was ready, absolutely ready for publication, a couple of weeks before the Russian troops attempted to occupy not just some areas of Donbass, but also Kyiv, Kherson, and so on. And after some, let's say, thinking about it, considering, I've decided that I will publish this book as it was written, as it was, let's say, finalized before it. Even though I'm asking myself all the time, maybe still it could have been reasonable to add something about, like, what's happened after February 2022. Maybe it will be in the next book, I don't know. And probably the most important point here is that, at least for me, I treat this story, again, not as a local history, not as the so-called krayeznavstvo, so like the detailed presentation of some local interesting places and on sites of interest. But for me, it was a kind of an invitation for all of us to look for a new analytical language to talk about Ukrainian and European history in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. And I would be really happy if the readers of the book will not just maybe like know a bit more about Dnipro, southern Ukraine, stuff like that, but also consider how all of us, in our different fields of research, how we could at least start producing, creating this new analytical language we desperately need nowadays, when we see how history is manipulated again in all possible ways. So I hopefully I dedicated my book also to this search for a new stylistic and analytical approach to our region. Thank you very, very much indeed. So I'll try my best to answer all your questions or to respond to all comments or disagreements.
Okay, well, I'm going to take my privileged position as interlocutor and ask Andrii questions for the next maybe 40 minutes. And then I am going to try to restrain myself from asking further questions, and I will open it up to the audience and let them talk. So my first question is, this is something I'm always interested in, you know, as a writer and a historian when I'm talking to other writers and other historians, is the story of how the book percolated and how the book came to being, even before it was kind of an academic plan. So Andrii grew up, you know, in Dnipropetrovsk, and you grew up in Soviet Dnipropetrovsk. And that city clearly made a very deep impression on you. And this is something I've often thought about with many of my Ukrainian friends and colleagues, and not only Ukrainian friends and colleagues, but this deep attachment to city. For those of you who have read, you know, Olesa's book, The Loss, which you should all read if you haven't, Lviv plays a very important role, you know, in that book. And this attachment to places where one was formed. And as a rootless cosmopolitan American Jew, I've always been kind of fascinated by this, because I grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is a kind of suburban city in Pennsylvania, eastern Pennsylvania, between Philadelphia and New York. And I have never even remotely considered writing a book about it. It's never attracted my interest. I was very happy to flee from that place as quickly as I could. I'm vaguely nostalgic when I run into people who came from Allentown. Like one of Serhiy Zhadan's extraordinarily talented English translators is coincidentally from Allentown. But it never had inspired in any direct way a sense of like, this is a story that I have absorbed through my own biography, you know, and I feel close to, and there's something I want to say about it, you know. And clearly that process of growing up, you know, in what was then Dnipropetrovsk, what is now Dnipro, you know, the Soviet experiment, the Ukrainian experience made a very deep impression, that at a time when you could write about whatever you'd like and you could go whatever you'd like, you're continually turning back in your thoughts, and it continues to make a big impression on you. Can you talk a little bit about like how that, you know, coming of age in this city, like the impressions it made and the ways in which that made you drawn to the idea of telling this story?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Marci. I'm asking myself like all the time how it happened. What I could tell for sure that the idea of writing a book came to me after leaving my native city. So when I worked and lived there, was a student also, my primarily, let's say, research interest was, you know, kind of Polish history, Central European stuff, so to say. And afterwards, so after some experience in Poland and Lviv, and then working in Kyiv, I came to this idea that actually, like, a good topic to write and to think about is Dnipro, so the place where I was born and raised. So in this sense, one could speculate that it was still done with some distance, at least personal distance. So it's not a book written in Dnipro. It is about Dnipro. It's written afterwards, after the end of my, let's say, lifetime there. And, you know, I've made a mistake, or kind of, you know, irresponsible gesture, if you wish, because in 2012, I've announced publicly in Kyiv that I'm planning to write this book, and to write it quickly, like, you know, just like maybe in a couple of months. And then happened something I already mentioned, and then it took 10 years to finalize the project. At some point, there were plans to publish it in German, and in Germany first. And then a number of publishers rejected this idea, refused even to look into manuscript because it's not interesting. It was not interesting for them. And I'm actually, let me say that that's an important occasion. And then, thanks to a person whom I see like in our Zoom room, Oleg Kotsuba, this book went to the US and to the US publisher. And now I am actually happy about it, because probably this, like the first version in English, that's probably a good decision, because for me, again, for me, it was always like, it was not just the story of let's say, my place, a kind of nostalgic book. Yeah, it's much more a book which could hopefully be interesting also for people who are not from Dnipro, who are not really like interested in this particular place, but people who would like to know more and to understand more about this entire region, yeah, East Central Europe, if you wish. And Dnipro is just a location we use to think about those broader topics and broader issues. I'll put it this way, because again, like in terms of local history, you could always say, like you have like omitted some persons or buildings or whatever. And of course, there are like a number of omissions. But my main concern was to make this narrative relevant also for the people who have absolutely no personal or whatever connection to the place. Really, whether I succeeded in doing it, I don't know. It's not for me to judge, but it was really important for me. And who knows, maybe at some point I'll write another book, much more nostalgic about my own experiences. But this book is not done in this direction, at least in my maybe naive self-perception.
Oh, hey, let me ask another kind of writerly historian's question. So one of the things I thought reading this book is that I can imagine very different audiences. I can imagine people who are interested in understanding the role that very particular city plays today, and in particular has played since 2014, which I want to get to in a few minutes, but first I want to go back in time. But I could also imagine teaching this book to students who want a more general sense of the history of Ukraine and the Tsarist Empire and the Soviet experiment, because by narrowing the geographical focus, I found it's actually much easier to follow certain motifs than what you get in a synthesis that attempts to synthesize a much larger space. You know, so Andrii begins, for those of you who haven't read the book, I mean, he's beginning in early modern times. One of the things I always admire about historians who go back to the pre-modern period is that you actually have to understand things about the natural world, the physical world, natural as in nature, natural as in rocks and rivers and mountains and things like that. You know, so one of the things I learned reading this book is that the rapids on the Dnipro River played a very large role in how things were settled and how they could be settled or not settled. So he goes all the way back to these pre-modern times and how cities were being settled. And so you go through the Dnipro and the rapids and the geology and the geography and the steppe, these plains. You go through Cossacks. It's a very good explanation of the Cossacks, which tend to get thrown around, you know, as a category in lots of histories of the Tsarist Empire and of Ukraine, and American readers have no idea who Cossacks are, or is it another word for Ukrainians, or was it a kind of social category that just didn't happen to be a peasant or noble, or were they warriors, or were they just people with funny haircuts? Like, and the book is very pedagogically useful that way, that it kind of very kind of clearly and explicitly explains, okay, then we introduce the Cossacks, you know, and then there's this guy Potemkin. You know, we use the phrase Potemkin city a lot, but most people don't actually know what a Potemkin city is. There's this guy Potemkin in the imperial period, and he has lots of plans and lots of ideas, but he tends not to follow through on them. So there's this issue of intentionality that Andrii writes about, like, what does it mean to very intentionally plan a city, and how rarely that actually gets realized according to intentions. We go through Catherine the Great's enlightened absolutism. If you're trying to explain to students what is enlightened absolutism, well, it still means, you know, everything is controlled by some autocratic monarch, but there are other things at play. There is a kind of distinct shift with modernity. There are, you know, liberal enlightenment influences. There is a kind of concern for some kind of harmony going on with society, for some kind of notion of law and structure. What effect does industrialization have? What does it mean that industrialization is something that doesn't only happen in Manchester in England, but also happens other places, although at different rates and sometimes with people coming and going from other places? You know, what does it mean to go through the extraordinary messiness of the First World War and the Bolshevik Civil War, you know, and the Polish Bolshevik War, you know, in the lands that are presently Ukraine, which is one of the most difficult things to teach. And every time I teach it, I have to kind of go back and try to like remember exactly which army was where and what date, because players are, and Andrii uses this wonderful term, which is symphony of revolutions of all of these different occupying forces coming through, you know, in the years, both kind of through and in the aftermath of the First World War. Kind of, as we know, the First World War doesn't really end in Ukraine in 1918. It kind of keeps going, kind of keeps bleeding into other places. And then we go through the whole Soviet experiment. We go through the stagnation of the Brezhnev years, and we go through this era where Dnipropetrovsk is a closed city, which is something I want Andrii to talk about in a bit. What does it mean to be, you start out being an intentional city, you know, and then you're going to end up with being a closed city, so that there's a kind of narrative arc that we're going from Potemkin city to Manchester to Soviet. We're going from a kind of, within that, there's a tension between the imperial narrative and the kind of Cossack Ukrainian narrative. There's an unfinished city that was intentional, it was unfinished, it was groundless, it was closed. We're going to end up, and I hope we get to this in maybe 15 minutes or so, of Dnipro as a kind of capital of Žydų Bandera, which is something I'm going to have Andrii talk about soon. So this very longue durée history that also, through the prism of a very specific place, you know, and a single city, kind of illuminates this whole arc. So one of the things I guess what I want to ask Andrii now to say a little bit about, as well as what did you learn and what did you want to show readers going through this longue durée? Very few historians can go through time. And you know, one of the reasons that historians are attracted to biography is that biography gives us a natural narrative arc. You know, someone was born and somebody dies. It's the only arguably natural narrative arc, because otherwise any place you choose to begin a story, to begin a history and end it is arbitrary. You know, because life goes on, because historians have an infinite regression problem. At any given moment where you start, something happened before that conditions your starting point. So this choice of a city and a kind of biography of a city, you know, is particularly interesting because in some ways it functions analogous to the biography of a person, because you're narrowing onto a micro level, and the city does have a kind of beginning. You can kind of, you know, even though, like, you know, maybe people are sent into the archives, you know, for political reasons to choose a different beginning date, but you can kind of look, there was no city at some point, and then there is going to be a city. So there is a kind of beginning to a narrative arc. It's a much longer narrative arc than what you get with any human life. We're running through hundreds of years here and many different human lifespans. But there's no death, because life keeps going on, you know, unlike with an individual biography. So let's all a very kind of long, kind of flowery introduction for maybe Andrii, if you could talk about what it meant to write with that kind of arc, what you understood looking at the city from that kind of longue durée lens, and what it meant to diachronically take on such a large period of time while spatially keeping yourself very tightly focused.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, for this observation. So first of all, I'd like to confess that probably for me it was one of the most exciting parts of this work, actually, to try myself as a historian of different time periods and different like big questions, like the Second World War, yeah, and the Nazi occupation. Of course, it could be like a separate book about Nazi Dnipropetrovsk. Actually, the Germans, when they occupied the place, they never changed its name. So think about it. So the guy, the Bolshevik Petrovsky, still alive, sitting in Moscow, and the city named after him appears in all German Nazi documents as Dnipropetrovsk. And again, like you could find a lot of crazy stuff like that. So for me, it was very interesting. And I also decided, I don't know why, but somehow I decided to write my book chronologically. So like I started from this ancient stuff and then 18th century, and then I go into the contemporary. And I should admit that, for instance, for me, this 18th century Enlightenment story was really new and fascinating because, frankly speaking, I'm not a historian of the 18th century. Now, maybe a little bit. And I've liked it a lot. And actually, at the end, I also realized, and it's probably linked to what you just said, I've realized that I do not want to write like a proper big chapter on, I would say, independent Ukraine. So events since 1991, because that was the original plan, to have a big, long chapter about it. But then I've realized that actually, as you said, it's like, it's literally, it's an ongoing story. And how could you properly, historically write an ongoing story? Maybe you could still, but integrate it into a narrative of this place, where still like the previous chapters are about people who died already many years ago. And I decided to make this epilogue of the last part very short and very open in a sense of, you know, like upcoming events. And then this full-scale aggression came. So you see, maybe it was the right decision. I don't know. Speaking about like what was like surprising and interesting for me, let me put it this way. It's not in the book because it sounds a bit, let's say, ahistorical. But I'm afraid I have this impression, actually, that if you look at the last, let's say, more or less 300 years of cities history, one of the important elements in this story is, of course, and were, and are also nowadays are, migrations. So the story of Dnipro is very much the story of migrants and migrations. Also nowadays, when people escape the war in Kharkiv, Donetsk, Kherson region, and come into Dnipro. And now, interesting, despite the fact that this population exchange is always like ongoing, we could still dare to speak about some structural, or I don't even know how to call them, let's say, tendencies that have this long durée, let's say, meaning or effect. It's probably the result of some impact, of the natural landscape. Maybe it's about the influence of place on the people. So people are coming, but the place, the steppe, the Dnipro River, they are still there, even though changed by Soviet, let's say, projects of electric stations and so on. And that's actually what this Dnipropetrovsk Petrov book was about, that you're coming again and again to the same place, and in some sense it's still rootless as it was, let's say, in his childhood. So for me it was really interesting, even though I do believe that history has no end, and history has no like just 1, 2, or 3 meanings. It's very dynamic. It's also nowadays dynamic. And city is, as far as I could say, is reinventing itself again. And this process accelerated after 2014, right? We also, of course, have this very interesting, fascinating topic of decommunization and decolonization. That is not in the book because it, it happened afterwards, right? And again, thinking about those changes, one could dare to trace them a little bit back, for instance, to the events of the Symphony of Revolutions that you mentioned. Because again, dear colleagues, let's try to imagine it. In less than 3 years, we have more than 20 regime power changes in the city. And for instance, the Bolsheviks who finally controlled it, they managed to do it from the 7th attempt. So they've tried 6 times, failed, and then the 7th attempt was successful, very violent. So maybe it gives us some feeling, how complex, also how brutal, if you wish, how brutal history could be. And I'll put it this way, the book is published, but unfortunately can't stop thinking about it. So I have some like new ideas what could be added or maybe said differently in it, because exactly the book was finished, but the history goes on. And I'm pretty sure that at some point it will have a new angle, a new perspective on it. For instance, again, imagine, dear colleagues, I mentioned several times, for instance, Mariupol or Donetsk in my book, because both cities, both big cities in Donbass, they were part of this huge Katerynoslav gouvernement in the 19th century. And of course, talking about Mariupol before and after this recent Russian occupation, it's talking about literally like two different places. So we should be aware of it. We should be aware of it.
Let me, one of the concepts that caught my imagination, in part because it came on the heels of my reading Sergei Lebedev's novel, Untraceable, which also dealt with closed Soviet cities, which was never a category I had focused on before. Mm-hmm. So the Dnipropetrovsk was a closed city in the later part of the Soviet period. And so that the closedness kind of coincided with what then becomes Brezhnev era stagnation, and this feeling that has been so many historians and just ordinary people have tried to describe, the sense of time stopping, the sense of time being halted, the sense of stagnation. And I've long been interested in these kind of the different experiences of temporality at different historical moments. Could you maybe explain to the audience, assuming that other people like me hadn't previously had a sense of what did it mean to be a closed city? What did it mean for other people looking in at that being an inaccessible space? And what did it mean for the people who were living in it for it to be closed?
Yeah, that's indeed a very important part of the story. So Dnipropetrovsk was officially closed. Again, closed, when we are saying closed in this particular case, we're talking about closed for the foreigners. Also citizens of the so-called socialist countries like Poland or Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia. So it was not closed for the Soviet citizens. Let's be clear about it. So let's say if you lived in Kyiv, Lviv, or Moscow, Vladivostok, you could freely go. Okay, now, so Dnipropetrovsk was closed from 1959. So before Brezhnev became the Secretary General of the Soviet Union, a communist part of the Soviet Union. And it was opened again in Perebudova, Perestroika years, so 1987, yeah, Gorbachev already. And the highest, let's say, stage of this closedness, exactly, it coincides with the Brezhnev stagnation. So this, as you rightly said, this idea that actually you live in Soviet terms in a secure, predictable, stable economic and social conditions and situation. You have the same prices for, like major projects for decades. Yeah, for instance, like the price of, bread, butter, or milk is the same for 10 years. Imagine that. And now, talking about the perceptions of this closedness, I've tried, of course, to reflect on it a little bit. On the one hand, it was perceived as a kind of discrimination. For instance, for people who were active in arts, in Ukrainian or in Jewish underground artistic projects, because if the city is closed, if the city produces rockets, you have more KGB people, you have more control all around, let's say, city life. On the other hand, for a lot of people, closedness meant privilege, because the city was singled out as an important military plus economic object. And for instance, in terms of food supplies, it looked much better than many other cities of the Soviet Union. There was also this interesting mythology of special links between Soviet Dnipropetrovsk and Brezhnev's Moscow. right? This mythology of, let's say, the Dnipro people making party careers in Moscow and Kiev, and not only. And that is why actually it explains, I would say, a little bit at least, the difficulties or the paradoxes of economic and social and cultural transformation after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because when the Soviet Union collapsed and when this closedness collapsed, yes, you could meet foreigners on the streets. I remember, I could tell you as a child, I was going back home from school, and I've seen for the very first time in my life, in my native city, Dnipro, the Czechoslovak Skoda with this Czechoslovak numbers. It was a cultural shock, because normally you have no like cars with foreign numbers in the closed city. No way. You have just Soviet cars, Soviet numbers, and stuff like that. But again, when it all ended up, economic expectations linked to the independence of Ukraine, they were very high, as we all know, at first. And it was a real challenge for the local elites, if you wish, to formulate a new kind of local, name it like patriotism or whatever, in a situation when there is no need anymore in this entire rocket engineering and production industry. And you see this like creation of this positive mythology. It happened, but later on. So it happened more or less, as we already said, after 2014. And it happened, if you wish, more in political or, let's say, identity terms than in terms of economy, or something like that. And still, what we know that this entire Brezhnev's stagnation was and still is positively viewed by people of elder generations, because it is linked to this notion of stability, not discrimination or not repressions, but stability. And of course, the recent events, they changed it all dramatically. Otherwise, we still have, like in the years of Leonid Kuchma, also the guy from Dnipro, actually, right? We have, for instance, the renaming of the streets after Brezhnev, after Sherbytsky. So that's a pretty recent phenomenon. Not relevant anymore, but it was still relevant like 10 years ago. So in this sense, this closedness still, I would say, it's still there somehow present in the debate. And it's kind of now we are in this actually phase of like transfer or changing of this like closedness mythology into the mythology of the heart of Ukraine. But yeah, who knows? We'll see. It's a very dynamic story again.
Can I ask you when you were born into a closed city? Did you have a sense growing up that it was, I mean, it must have just felt normal to you, but did you have a sense of what it meant to be closed as opposed to open, or that, other kids in Soviet Ukraine were living in open cities? Were they being exposed to many more things? Did you feel deprived? Did you feel privileged?
It's always dangerous, of course, like to speak about such memories like afterwards. As far as I understand, rather no. But what I could tell you, what I really remember, like from my school years, because we've had to learn a lot, for instance, at that time. Oh, that's actually good for the place where we have our event tonight. So we've had, to learn a lot about London as a city, as a location, Trafalgar Square, British Museum, stuff like that. And of course, for me as a kid in the Soviet Dnipropetrovsk, it was clear that I would never go there. It's just kind of a story about London, you could tell about, but there is no chance at all to see it with your own eyes. And then, of course, it happened. So I've been to all those squares and museums, and it was a very strange feeling, because in our school program, it was purely abstract. It was just a topic to talk about and not to visit. And that was very much about closedness, because again, you see, if you, for instance, as an engineer, right, worked on this southern machine building factory, or the constructors' bureaus of this factory, you were, of course, not supposed to go abroad. As someone who has this access to, you know, to the secret rocket information, whatever. And if you look at the university, for instance, where I graduated from, same story. Like, imagine you were a professor of history, as we've had a prominent Ukrainian historian, professor of history in Dnipro, Mykola Kowalski. He was allowed himself to travel to Poland to do his research, to socialist Poland, but he could never invite his Polish colleagues to visit Dnipro in response, because for them, as a citizens of socialist Poland, there was no way to legally visit the Soviet closed city. So this closeness was always somehow there, but again, the city is really big, and that's like, that's important to feel it. It was big, it is big, and you don't really feel like you are closed, yeah, yourself. It's more about, again, like this, like general knowledge of what is going on. And again, believe me that it was clear to everyone in Dnipro what is going on this factory, that it was all about rockets and so it was like not a secret at all. It was just like official secret for, let's say, Soviet propaganda, but for everyday life, it was pretty clear, like where you live in. Yeah.
Let me, since I want to leave everybody else some time for questions, I'm going to move us perhaps a bit up to the present. So one of the things that has always kind of fascinated me about Soviet history in particular, really the whole history of the communist experiment, is this preoccupation with time. You know, and of course, when the Soviet, I mean, Lenin's major modification among his many modifications of Marxism was this idea that time could be rushed. History could be rushed. Yes, it's moving along in a certain direction, but you can nudge it. You can jumpstart it. You know, and then there's that famous Stalinist era slogan, not just, you know, will fulfill the 5-year plan in 4 years, but also this catching up and overtaking. We're going to catch up and overtake the West. Everything was about rushing time, the sense of the acceleration of time that was so seductive for so many intellectuals, the idea that like a rocket, you could actually rush time. And then the irony that when I first got to the post-communist world in the early 90s, everyone I talked to described to me this sense of, for 20 years, time had stopped. You don't know what it was like. Time didn't move. Between 1968, nothing happened. Time just stopped. This experience of going from time being so radically rushed to time having been halted. And then when I actually got to Dnipropetrovsk in 2015, there was a sense that time had, not in a Stalinist way, but time was certainly moving again. You know, and it was moving in a very energetic, invigorated, kind of particularly intense way. If I can just intervene with a little thank you note. So Andrei's sister, Tatiana, met me when I came to Dnipropetrovsk, which was then still Dnipropetrovsk, in 2015. And I think the very first night I was there, she took me on a very long walk all around that city, you know, which was my first impression and absorption of that city. And she had a toddler at the time, and I'm sure many other things she was supposed to be doing, but she was extremely generous and very expressive. And we walked for hours, and I felt like I soaked in a lot of things I would not have seen otherwise had I been walking myself. So thank you, Tatiana, if you're listening, wherever you are. She is also a historian. And it was maybe a year into the war in the Donbass. There were a lot of divided families there. There were a lot of people I met who had come from the Donbass, fleeing the war, leaving behind family members who chose to stay or who decided that they were safer in one of the separatist republics or believed the Russian propaganda. So there was a sense of time dividing, of family splitting, but also of time rushing forward. I mean, some of Tatiana's friends who she introduced me to to said, you know, we had thought we were about to give up. We were about to give up on Ukraine. We were about to give up on this place, you know, and then the Maidan happened. And then look at how this city mobilized, you know, after the little green men showed up in Crimea, and after these, you know, quote unquote Russian tourists were provoking this war in the East. And now this is where I want to be. Now I feel like this is where something is happening. Now I feel like everything's moving forward, you know, and that was a kind of fascinating thing to experience, you know, and it was quite far east of Kiev. It was not far from the Donbass, you know, it was geographically very close. People were coming back and forth across the front lines all the time. But there was a sense that the city had kind of gone through an existential transformation, you know, in a relatively short period of time, and was coming into its own in another way, you know, and on the level of a city, that was a fascinating thing to watch. Can I ask you to talk about that? What has it been to watch time slow down, speed up, you know, to watch this epilogue of a city that, you know, you were born into when it was closed in Soviet times, and suddenly, you know, came on a world historical stage in a certain way in 2014 that perhaps nobody could have anticipated?
Yeah, I have more or less the same impression, actually. And there is some remarks on it in the book, so in the epilogue. Actually, this notion of time stopped, it's interesting that it could be found among other texts, in the text by prominent texts, I should say, and art by Ilya Kabakov, who recently died in New York and who was also born in Dnipropetrovsk. And he wrote very interesting memoirs about his childhood in this deeply provincial, as he said, the city. And coming back to what happened in 2014, yeah, I would say that for a lot of people, it was kind of, yeah, maybe unexpected, maybe expected. I've heard different opinions about it, actually. But the fundamental question remains, of course, and the question is why Donetsk and Luhansk, so two also big industrial cities, yeah, historically deeply connected with Dnipro, why they turned into the so-called capitals of those so-called pseudo-republics, yeah, controlled by Russia, and why Dnipro, on the contrary, became the stronghold of Ukrainian identity, right? Also Ukrainian Jewish identity, of course, no doubt about it. And I would say that in order to analyze this story, we need a very serious and, let's say, contextual, situational approach. So we need to look very precisely what was done by various social actors. I mean, political elites on the local level, business elites, sometimes it's the same, sometimes not, but also civil society, also, let's say, at least partly international institutions. And then we'll see that actually, in case of Dnipro, unlike Donetsk and Luhansk, we have this kind of, one could say, yeah, consensus that this place is Ukraine and should remain Ukraine. And it happened, despite the fact that many of those prominent and ordinary people who made this decision, they were Russian speaking, or they were not, let's say, really like belonging to, let's say, Ukrainian culture and core, whatever we call it. So we are talking, in my view, about this very interesting phenomenon of political loyalty or political identity, Ukrainian political identity. And we are also talking about a situation where the local Dnipro elites managed to stop any Russian troops or weapons from Russia coming into the area, right? Because what happened in Donetsk, what happened in Luhansk, it was exactly the opposite. So the local elites, they allowed the weapons and people from Russia to enter it and to start, let's say, the at first political, the military process that is now considered rightly to be the beginning of the Russia's war against Ukraine. And when it all happened, like when we all like realized that Dnipro escaped the fate of Donetsk, right? There was a big this reconsideration again of cities' self-image, and then we have this notion, like beautiful metaphorical notion of the heart of Ukraine. Actually, maybe I should tell this anecdote, because in the original manuscript, the epilogue was called the heart of Ukraine. But then one of reviewers said, "Oh no, like it's too metaphorical. It's not good for academic book. You should change it." And I'm like, I've tried to argue against it, but then I said, "Oh, okay, like we could change it and just mention it in the text itself, so not in the title, not in the title." Because again, dear colleagues, seriously, if you're talking about this like heart of Ukraine, it's very important that by assuming this some description, we're kind of saying that Dnipro is actually central, so it's not eastern. Right, it's not like east, as it is often, you know, perceived, let's say, in this imagined geography, but it's central, as heart is central for human body. Yeah, it's central for Ukrainian existence, for Ukrainian development. And in this sense, I would say that this idea of being a heart of Ukraine is also an idea of like moving from the east, imaginable east, yeah, to the center of Ukrainian project. And maybe in this respect, I should also tell you that looking back at the texts about the city, we will see that already in the 18th century, you have this very strong and very reasonable, I would say, a notion of southernness, of being a southern place, not an eastern, but a southern place, Pivdenne misto, a place which is really hot in summer, like now, and which has this kind of, if you wish, even partly like a Mediterranean attitude to, you know, like everyday practices in the summertime, not in winter, of course. So this move happened, and now we're experiencing like the continuation of the story, because like when the war went on, as we all know, it was exactly, and still is, Dnipro, who became a part, or like the principal part, or like the hub, if you wish, yeah, for military and medical and social and name it, like support for Ukrainian military and for the refugees, internally displaced persons, and so on. So in this sense, I would dare to say that Dnipro found its city, its positive city mythology in this story, despite its deeply tragic nature of the events and brutality and violence of the events.
Well, as usual, I always have too many questions, but I think we should let the audience ask questions now. Maybe Olesa, maybe you could remind me, what is our question methodology here?
Yes, so the audience can ask questions directly with the video on if they wish. If you raise your hands, we'll be able to turn your videos on and unmute you, or you could post your questions in chat and we'll read them out. I think there's one question, two questions in chat already, I believe. I say if you are able to read them, from Lucy Murray, I think. And while Marci is reading the questions, I just would like to remind everybody that we are recording this discussion, and we will put the recording on our YouTube channel soon. So you'll be able to share it with your friends and contacts if you wish to.
Oh, okay, I see. This is, sorry, I started reading the chat from the beginning. I'm very bad at both reading and speaking at the same time. Okay, so this is from Lucy Murray. Okay, could you explain why Dnipro was renamed by the Verkhovna Rada, but it continued to be referenced as part of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast?
Yeah, sure. So it was renamed rightly, not by the, let's say, local city council, but by the Verkhovna Rada, because again, dear colleagues, you see, and this time period, so 2016, there was a kind of a consensus local that one could still use the name Dnipropetrovsk because nobody cares anymore about Petrovsky. That's, you know, that's kind of this debate about invisible monuments. So you could have a monument no one refers to, or you could have a name which has, and actually I remember being like a student and later on also a researcher asking people, and even some colleagues of mine, it was difficult for them to define like which Petrovsky are we talking about. Maybe it's Peter the First, so the Russian emperor, maybe it's Saint Peter from the Bible, and so on. So it's an interesting that Petrovsky as a, let's say, as an ideological figure, he somehow faded from the story, but still this renaming was made by Verkhovna Rada. And why the oblast is still Dnipropetrovsk? Because this name, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, is written down in the Ukrainian constitution. So to change it, you need, it's a bit crazy, but it is formally like that. You need to change the constitution, which requires the absolute majority of votes in the parliament. So it would probably happen later or sooner, but because of the fact of this constitutional text, yeah, the name of region is different than the name of the city.
I always find these renaming debates very interesting. When I got to Dnipro, the Lenin, I was hearing stories about how the Lenin monument had dismantled during the Leninopad, and I got very vivid descriptions of just how difficult it was to get this extremely large, heavy monument down. And then there was this empty space. You know, it hadn't been replaced by anyone else. It was this, you have a picture of this in your book, this kind of empty signifier. And that several years ago, or relatively recently in the States, we started having, or that came into the public sphere, big debates about taking down statues from the South. During the American Civil War, taking down statues of Southern generals, of people who were pro-slavery. And it happened very belatedly in America. We had big debates about this on Yale's campus, about one of the residential colleges that was named after Calhoun, which, to be perfectly honest and confessional, like I had not even associated that name with anybody in particular, the way I had not thought about the names of any of the other buildings in particular. But once people turned their attention, Calhoun was a very nasty white supremacist, you know, pro-slavery Southern politician. And then there were demands for renaming. And one of the things that Americans said, like, but we can't just go around taking down statues and renaming things. And as a Slavicist, as an East European says, of course you can. People do it all the time. When I first got to Eastern Europe in the 1990s, all the streets were being renamed, and you would get a map, but the taxi driver would be referring to everything else by different names, and it was very confusing, especially if you were a foreigner, because everyone called all the streets and other names. And when I got to Dnipro in 2015, a lot of people were saying that, well, this is a city where not all the streets have yet been renamed, that we have been slow to rename the streets, and now we need new commissions to rename the streets, you know, and we have to take down all the names that are Soviet-like names, you know, and come into this post-Soviet period. Do you feel like that, like there was a reason why that renaming process happened at different moments in different places in Ukraine, and was that significant?
I would say because like it depends on this notion. Yeah, let's say on the priorities. Let's put it this way. So for a lot of people in Dnipro, they would argue that there are much more important, relevant social, economic issues than, you know, just renamings. Now it's different, actually. There were many renamings during the, let's say, the last phase of the war, right? But as you rightly said, Lenin's place is still empty. So again, like if you remove the monuments, it does not necessarily mean that you have an idea of what to place instead, right? So you have like different options. You could just leave it like that. You could make maybe a historical explanation what stood there before, but in this case, it's mostly emptiness. And maybe I should mention it in this point because you see, like monuments are monuments. Dnipro has a kind of a like particular attitude again to its past, Some people I talked to said that it's like this step attitude, because if it's step, then like nothing is stable. Yeah, it's all like, you know, it's all like, yeah, it's kind of this nomadic, yeah, nature character. Because think about it, in such a big and important imperial Soviet Ukrainian center, you have no single big cemetery preserved, at least from the pre-Second World War time. So if you want to go to visit, I would love to actually, old cemeteries, for instance, the memorials to the victims of the anti-Jewish pogroms of 1905, to look at the graves of Ukrainian writers, young professors, again, to attend the old Jewish cemetery, you will not find them. You have sometimes you have just like a park where it used to be. Sometimes it is, you know, it is covered by stadiums or houses or whatever. And it kind of shows you that there is a problem with the attitude to the past. And again, you see, like, think about it seriously. Like, if you don't remember or don't care anymore who Petrovsky was, yeah, it's still kind of a special attitude, because if you say, okay, we want to keep him because it's the part of our, you know, past, that's like one attitude. But if you say, we are not interested in the fact like who this guy was, like who cares, it's irrelevant, it's still like a different argument behind. And in this sense, one could speculate, and I'm quoting such authors also in my book, that Dnipro still needs to find its cultural symbolic mythology. One could define in, again, Odessa or Lviv or other places. And actually, you see again, like I see here like one of the questions about another important city in Ukraine. Again, dear colleagues, think about it. If you took, for instance, if you take a place, I mentioned several times in my book, Kryvyi Rih, where President Zelensky was born. It's a huge industrial city, which history is closely linked to the history of Dnipro. But if we start looking for books or even articles in English about this place, we'll find, okay, we'll find biographies of Zelensky, and that's it. So in this sense, it's really like, it's kind of like interesting and sad that this important region, I mean, southern Ukraine, so Kryvyi Rih, Kherson, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia, Dnipro, it's still, I would say, it still fails to present itself properly in historiographical or cultural terms. So there is a lot of work to be done by scholars who will research this part of Ukraine and this part of Europe.
One of the things I especially appreciated both about Andrei's writing in general and this book in particular, which, and I know this is it's a particularly difficult moment to achieve this, has to do with not only kind of methodology and analytical language, but also tone and the relationship between the writer, and the material, and it's very difficult to take on a topic like this, all the more so at a time of existential life and death stakes, and a moment when your own identity is wrapped up in it, and be neither damning nor hagiographic, to have that composure, to be both kind of inside and outside. And there are books about lots of legendary cities which try to be damning and say the city is not as beautiful and nice as you think it is. It really has a dark side, or this city has always been neglected, and look, it's this kind of pearl and it's beautiful and perfect. And Andrei really does neither one of these things. There's a very deep cosmopolitanism in the book. It's not an apology for anti-Semitism, and it's not a defense against anything, and it's looking at the different population movements. It looks at the Ukrainian speakers and the Russian speakers. It does not essentialize the ethnic identity of any of those populations, looks at the German Mennonites, looks at the Jews, looks at the Poles who come in, with really a historian's curiosity, with the sense that this all makes the story very interesting, that the fact that it's complicated makes it more interesting, and that's why it's a great topic for a historian, but with a kind of remarkable appreciation for that, without a kind of attempt to kind of come in and say, really, it's always been Ukrainian and everyone else should get out because it should essentialize our Ukrainian identity, you know, and really we were always corrupted by X. It's none of that. It's always kind of like throughout, it's very, very nuanced. It's, you know, there's this going on, and then there's this going on, and then this came in, and that was precisely the kind of richness of the cocktail in this very layered way. I think this is symbolized some way in that phrase, symphony of revolutions, which is an extremely aesthetic way of looking at this extraordinarily bloody moment. But there was something symphonic about it, because one revolution was kind of layered over, was overlapping on another one. So let me then ask, did that kind of existential relationship to the place of your birth, you know, and to your own, it's your hometown, but it's also, even though you're not living there, you still have family there. I mean, Tatiana's there, her family's there, her kids are there. So you're still very tied to it. It's not a place you've left behind in that sense. Did you go through different stages, from conceiving of the book before the Maidan to working on the book in the aftermath of the Maidan, when the Jewishness of the city and the Žido-Bandera capital nature of the city, which you could talk about a bit, became particularly prominent, you know, and now watching it go through perhaps, you know, the biggest existential stake, you know, in modern history? Has your relationship to the city changed? Has your attitude towards the city changed? How did you maintain your composure? Was there a tension between, you know, the attempt to maintain composure and your own attachments, or was it precisely your own attachments that gave you a kind of natural appreciation for that complexity?
Well, of course, as you could imagine, if the writing of the book took 10 years, it inevitably, it changed a lot. And actually, I should admit, for instance, that my idea about the title of the book changed as well. I'm not going to give you the original, the original titles, but of course, they were still about Dnipropetrovsk, first and foremost, because when I came to this book idea, Yanukovych was still a president, you know, and the entire situation looked differently. Actually, I'm rather happy now that it took so long for me to finish writing seriously, because I kind of corrected myself, and I've discovered new sources, and actually a lot of friends of mine, they shared their sources, because, you know, if everybody knows for 10 years that you're writing a book about Dnipro, then you have people who will say, Andrii, I've been reading something completely different, but you have this Dnipro coming out. And for instance, one of my best friends and colleagues, Katrin Biga, she gave me a fascinating quote from a Romanian, so the notebook of a Romanian female prisoner of war, sent from Transylvania to post-Second World War Dnipro to rebuild the industrial objects. And so sometimes there are like really like unique materials used in the book, because colleagues shared them with me. Otherwise, I really, how to put it, like, I think that every historian should try her or his best to be more or less honest about, the different types of dangers, linked to our personal, you know, like, personal attitudes to different things. And I decided that it's not the most important part of like my interest in the city's history. So I really tried my best to give voice to very different, let's say, sources, groups, attitudes. And that is why I suppose that a careful reader yeah, could make his own conclusions out of it. Really, it was not my task to say like, look, like this guy has a good point, and this is stupid. No, 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 not at all. Even though, of course, I have preferences. Let's not pretend I'm not. And actually, now, like, listen to our discussion, I came to the conclusion that most probably this entire stuff about symphonies and this attitude to revolutions, it was really affected by Valerian Kidmogil's prose, because the guy actually spent the revolutionary years in Katerynoslav, Dnipro, and yeah, then he became one of the most prominent Ukrainian writers in the 1920s, and then he was arrested and killed by the Stalinist regime. And that's actually in his novels, you could see how complex and tragic and also funny this experience of revolutions, yeah, was to the place. Yeah, so probably the book is still very personal, but it was like I've tried to stop myself from becoming too personal or too too engaged in a way of it, even though, of course, if you live for years, like for 20 and more years in one place, you have all types of experiences, not just pleasant ones, yeah, also unpleasant. And it's kind of, you know, it's all around. I don't know, I see that there are some more like questions in our chat, dear Marci. I'm not sure whether we have enough time. Maybe I'll try my best very briefly to respond to them, because for instance, like Victoria Grivina, she asks about this Dnipro-Kharkiv relations. Very, very interesting point. And actually, you know, I've just read this new edition of Volodymyr Kravchenko, English language biography of Kharkiv. And I was positively amazed that even some topics are the same. Like you could read it in a way as a parallel history, let's say Dnipro-Kharkiv, even though, of course, Kharkiv was, attention, dear colleagues, Kharkiv was officially a capital of Soviet Ukraine for some time, right? So 1990, 1934. And Dnipro was never officially a capital, but you have this kind of capital dreams all the time. You have Potemkin's dreams about the southern capital of the Russian Empire. You have this notion of Brezhnev's capital. You have Jewish capital of Ukraine. So you see, like, it was never like a capital per se, a proper capital, but this capital mythology is still, yeah, somehow present. And there is no contradiction, I would say so, between the southern dimension, the southernness of Dnipro, and its linkage to Kharkiv as the next big industrial, political, cultural center in Ukraine. Yeah, and maybe I should also say that, dear colleagues, because it is in Irina Skubi's question, and it's probably what we really need to mention, that when we're talking about nature, Cossacks, Lower Dnipro River, and stuff like that, this terrible story of Kakhovska Dam, right, and its destruction by the Russian troops, it is directly linked to what we're talking about. Because the station in Zaporizhia, as well as the one now non-existent in Kakhovka, they were both parts of this big Soviet project, coming back to Russian time, yeah, and accelerating time, the Soviet project of, turning the Dnipro River under control, getting rid of the rapids, yeah, those rocks out of the water, but also getting rid of the areas where actually the Cossacks settled, yeah, in the early modern times. And we've all just experienced, yeah, the environmental and human costs of this war crime committed by Russia. And it's very much part of this story. I would say that the history of this entire region, the steppe region of Ukraine, it was deeply linked, yeah, to the environmental situation, absolutely. And it started being like rapidly changed, first and foremost in the Soviet years, but also a little bit in late 19th century through this entire, let's say, industrialization project and uniting actually Kryvyi Rih with Donbass, this famous railroad and all this stuff around it. So in this sense, one could of course say that human not just interaction, but human attempts to conquer nature in the lower Dnipro area is something that was kind of, you know, like Russian time in the early 20th century. And we still have to face it now, because seriously, like, it's a very important question. What would happen to, let's say, this Kakhovka, and now after all the events, all the destructions and so on. And it's all part of this story as well. Absolutely.
Alyssa, do we have time for me to read the Misha Simovsky's question?
I think we certainly have enough time for one question for sure.
Okay, let me read this out. How did you approach the research process? This is by Misha Simovsky. How did you approach the research process for the book? As you've mentioned, history is largely erased, not preserved, and unlike in the West, the topic of researching local history in Ukraine is not popular among historians, so the sources and materials may not be readily available. And finally, did you learn something new for yourself while conducting research, considering that you studied history in the university there and might have already formed certain opinions about it? I mean, I can add maybe in conclusion, was there something that surprised you, you know, in particular about your own city that you encountered doing research?
Yeah, so thank you. First of all, thank you, dear Misha. Yes, of course. First of all, you're right. It's hard. Okay, nowadays it's easier, actually. It's easier also for me to understand that, but before that it was a kind of a really like traumatic information experience. For instance, what happened to the local archives during the Second World War? They were largely destroyed. So if you're looking for sources on particular time periods, it's exactly, one could use this term erased, yeah, or destroyed. And now we have the same in Kherson, unfortunately, of course, due to the Russian occupation, right? So I've tried my best to collect as much as I could, also in archives outside Ukraine, but it was just the first step. I've never pretended, and of course I'm not pretending now, that I've, you know, collected, yeah, like the basic source, yeah, collection for the story. Again, if you write the very first synthesis, you're always selective, and you always miss a lot. Believe me, dear colleagues, like recently, like last weeks, I've got new exciting Polish books, for instance, and I'm sort of like, oh my God, it's so sad because it would fit perfectly, you know, into my into my narrative, but I've read them, you know, too late. So I could give you the title, but it's not, yeah, it's not in the book. So maybe in the next one. It happens all the time, and actually, I could say that I was still positively surprised about the amount of sources, also personal documents or ego documents, yeah, one could still find. Because when I started, I believed in a naive way that, who knows, maybe there are no diaries, for instance, diaries written by locals during the Holodomor or during the Nazi occupation. Now I know that there are diaries, actually, maybe not a lot, not like hundreds of them, but still there are very interesting personal texts. There is a huge potential for oral history. I've read it a little bit, among others, for the history of the Jewish community. So I've tried my best to talk to those people who are still alive and who remember about the Jewish underground informal life in Brezhnev years. And I'm sure it could be done more in this direction, and so on. So in this sense, when you are starting research, any topic, especially such a huge one, like again, 300 ideas and all possible languages, you will always be surprised to find out new materials, indeed. And in this sense, it's really like a never-ending process. And I will be very, very happy. That's probably my biggest hope, that some colleagues of mine, including my sister, of course, mentioned by Marci, that then continue this job, just looking for more materials, looking for more questions, looking for more possible angles, to do it again and to integrate Dnipro, Ukrainian history, even more into the, like grand narratives of Central Eastern European histories we are all writing nowadays. And now I'm waiting with kind of surprise as well, if I may say so, for the reviews, because I hope there will be reviews. I also hope for negative reviews, of course, which is very good, which could help you to, to reconsider what you've done. And most probably, like in 1 year, plus minus, I would love to write a review response article to those reviews, if everything goes well. Yeah, so I'm very, very grateful for all your comments and your attention. And I would be very pleased if you find time to read this book. And I'm always, of course, eager to discuss it. And maybe I should also mention it that our chair, our professorship of Entangled History of Ukraine in Frankfurt Oder is open to all types of, ideas, suggestions. You're always welcome to contact us, and I'll be happy to stay in touch. And of course, I'm very, very grateful to my good friend and colleague, Marci Shore, Ukrainian Institute London, for giving me such an occasion to talk about my book online. To all, that's a great honor and great pleasure. And thank you, dear Marci. It's really, I'm so happy that we've had this chance to chat a little bit, at least online again. Yeah, so thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you.
Marci, go ahead.
Oh no, thank you. I'm very happy to see Andrii, even even virtually, the way one sees one another now. Yeah, thank you so much, Olesa, for inviting us. It was really a pleasure.
It's an absolute honor to host you both and to discuss Andrii's new book. And we just really hope that we can repeat this in a maybe slightly different format in person in London. We'd absolutely love to see you all and to have you speak about this and other topics in person, and treat this as an open invitation. So whenever either and both of you are in London, we'd love to see you. And just before I thank the speakers and all of you who came to join us today, I'd like to mention that our literature course is halfway through the 8 weeks of the course. So we've already done 4, but 4 are still remaining, and you can enroll to separate seminars if you wish to, and one of them will be looking specifically about the literatures of Eastern Ukraine, so that might be relevant to what we've been discussing today. That's with Sasha Dovzhik. One will be a comparative Ukrainian Jewish literature, that's with O.M. Blacker. Vitaly Chernetsky will be speaking about Russophone literature, and I think I'm forgetting another one, but you could look through the schedule and enroll if you wish to do so. Yes, please do buy Andrii's new book. I've learned a lot. I hope you did too. And once again, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Marci Shore and Andrii Portnov. You were wonderful speakers, and we can't wait to see you in London.